anniversary of the end of World War II. 67 years ago today, President Harry Truman ordered U.S. and British forces to begin the Berlin Airlift. U.S. and Western allies defied the Soviet Union by flying much-needed supply to starving Berliners. They were victims of a Soviet blockade, considered by many to be the dawn of the Cold War. In Context tonight, John Terrett looks back at that crucial moment in world history.
It was the pivotal action that marked the dawn of the Cold War. The start of the decades-long era so wrought with tension, it took the United States and the Soviet Union to the brink of global nuclear war. It started at the end of World War II in Europe.
General Eisenhower informs me that the forces of Germany have surrendered to the United Nations. The flags of freedom fly all over Europe.
Germany had surrendered. Much of the country was in ruins. In 1945, the Allied powers that had defeated the Nazis held historic meetings in Yalta and Potsdam, tasked with maintaining peace and dividing up Germany's territories. The leaders came up with a plan to split the defeated nation into 4 Allied occupation zones. They gave the eastern part of the country to the Soviet Union, the western part to the US, Great Britain and France. Even though Berlin was completely within the Soviet occupation zone, it was split down the middle between the West and the Soviets. Stalin quickly grew uneasy with having half of a capitalist city in Soviet territory. He decided to try to starve the West out with a blockade. On June the 23rd, 1948, the first real showdown between the US and the Soviet Union began. The blockade. The Soviet Union closed all roads, rails and canals between West Berlin and West Germany. No supplies could get in. War-torn Berliners had very little food. The Soviets cut off electricity and there was no coal for heat. But the West refused to leave. The American commander in Germany told Washington, D.C., if we withdraw our position in Berlin, Europe is threatened. Communism will run rampant. President Truman agreed and took action.
You are clear to take off, Evan.
On June 24, 1948, the US and Western allies began flying planes through Soviet-occupied territories into Berlin. They were loaded with food, coal and medical supplies.
Food, still more food and raw materials had to be poured across the aerial bridge into the blockaded city.
They frequently returned loaded with German children escaping to the West. The Soviet Union watched, but the Allies say never stopped the flights for fear of retaliation. At one point, Western aircraft were taking off or landing every 90 seconds in Berlin and carrying with them 13 tons of supplies every day.
We had people come from Japan, from Panama, from China, all to bring the airplanes in. And we were just one of the groups up at Celle. We had Celle, Fosburg, Wiesbaden, and Rhein-Main.
Enough supplies were flown in that the Soviet Union eventually ended its blockade in May of 1949. The airlifts helped to heal the wounds of World War II between Germany and the Americans.
The Berlin Airlift, the Marshall Plan, and President Harry Truman really saved Berlin, West Germany, and Western Europe, because the Russians would have had you all.
But it started the severed relationship between Washington and Moscow. John Terrett, Al Jazeera.
Fred Hall is a retired staff sergeant in the U.S. Air Force and a veteran of the Berlin Airlift, who is the treasurer of the Berlin Airlift Veterans Association. He joins us from Baltimore. Mr. Hall, it is an honor to have you with us. You were barely out of your teens when you volunteered for the Berlin Airlift. Did you have any idea at that point as to how important the airlift would be?
I knew it was very important at the time. I had a grasp of what had to be done, that we had to keep Berlin free at all costs.
The Berlin blockade is seen by many as the first battle of the Cold War, and it really is difficult to overstate what you and your fellow air crews did. In effect, you kept more than 2 million people alive.
It was a logistics nightmare. it boggles our mind even today as how we did it.
It certainly required great heroism. You had to fly over hostile territory in planes that had none of the technology that we have today to guide them, planes that flew no matter what the weather. And more than 100 died in the airlift, 31 of them Americans. They and you were true heroes.
I think if you talk to anyone that was on the airlift, we don't consider ourselves the heroes. We consider the people of Berlin the heroes because of what they put up with to keep their freedom. They went through torture with a little bit to eat, bombed out buildings. The city of Berlin was 65% total loss. What was left wasn't hardly livable.
All those people went cold and hungry for so long. Were you disappointed when a little more than a decade later the Soviets and the East Germans put up the Berlin Wall?
I don't know whether it was a matter of disappointment. It was disgusting. We had figured that we had beat them down one way, and now they're going to try something else. And just to make it hard on people, and that part hurt.
Was the airlift and what you did for the people of Berlin one of the highlights of your life?
To this day, I said that was the best thing I ever did in my life, that I volunteered to go on the Berlin airlift because I felt worthwhile in that I saved people's lives. I didn't kill them.
And many Germans, I know, are thankful for what you and your fellow members of the military did to help those millions of Berliners. Fred Hall, really a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate you bringing us on and bringing up about the airlift, because very few Americans know too much about it. And it's one of the glory moments of this country that we saved all those lives. And it was a moment for all Americans to be proud of. And unfortunately, it's more or less forgotten.
And it should not be. Thank you, sir.
You're quite welcome.
An attack on diplomats in Somalia coming up on Al Jazeera. Al-Shabaab's latest